Explosion from your position?
Yes, we did. As a matter of fact, we heard it, and because I was just like standing there pretty much looking out the window, I didn't see what caused it or if there was an impact.
So you have no idea right now?
Oh, there's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God. Another plane has just hit. It hit another building. Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion. My God, it's right in the middle of the building.
This one into the East Tower?
Yes. Yes. Right in the middle of the building. And right now, that was definitely looked like it was on purpose.
You saw a plane?
Yes, I did.
I remember I was getting packed up that morning. I had a flight around noon. I was down in Houston. My wife and I had been down there visiting her mother, who was in the hospital. It's a bad time for us. My mother had just died about 6 weeks before. And my wife had to go up to Detroit for a job interview. But I stayed behind in Houston with her mother. And, but I had to fly out. We were going to meet at my father's house in Indiana. She was going to come down from Detroit driving a rental car, and I was going to fly up. But yeah, I was packing up and had the TV on, and wow, a jet airplane ran into the tower. That doesn't happen every day. But then a short time later, another jet slammed into the other tower. And I knew immediately it was an act of terrorism and an act of war. And then, of course, another plane slammed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and another plane crashed in Philadelphia. But it turned out later that it was on a flight path toward Washington as well, and some speculate that had the brave passengers not brought the plane down and trying to take control of it, that it was intended to take out the White House. But of course the president wasn't in the White House. He was in Florida reading to a bunch of kindergartners from My Pet Goat. Anyway, I remember I called my dad and said, "Dad, are you watching television?" You said, "Yeah, I'm watching, son." I said, "This is war, you know? The United States is under attack." "I know." So I thought I better call my wife. And she was in an interview. And I told her, she said, "I can't really talk now." And I said, "Well, look, the United States is being attacked by terrorists. They've blown up the Twin Towers and the Pentagon." And she said, "What?" So she told these executives in the room, and they didn't believe her, but there was a TV there, and they turned it on. And fortunately, the CEO who was interviewing her, his son was in one of the towers, and he was killed. But anyway, obviously my flight didn't go through, but all the planes throughout the United States were grounded immediately. And so I had a rental car, and a good thing I did, because they were all taken in a matter of hours once every plane in the United States was grounded. And so I went back to the hospital to tell my mother-in-law what was going on, and decided to stay another night in the hotel. But then I woke up around midnight or 2 in the morning. I said, "No, I'm getting out of here." So I drove all night and all the next day up to Indiana. It was so eerie. I mean, there were no cars on the road, and there were no vapor trails in the sky for a week. That was a strange time, and I think everybody probably remembers, you know, what they were doing, if you're old enough and lived in the United States. We found out later, though, that although every plane in the United States was grounded, bin Laden's family was escorted out of the country on planes. It's interesting, too, you know, here in the United States, you hear about the Russia probe. Robert Mueller is going to get to the bottom of Trump's collusion with the Russians. Well, interestingly, Robert Mueller was appointed as the head of the FBI 1 week before the 9/11 attack. And he was instrumental in suppressing the FBI investigation. I mean, obviously, there were, I think, 19 hijackers, and all 15 of them were Saudis. And what I've come to appreciate through LaRouche's investigation, incidentally, he was put in prison by Mueller in an operation to get LaRouche. Now it's a Mueller operation to get Trump. But he's like the British Empire's hitman. It turned out that the British arms maker, BAE, had made a deal with the Saudis. This was back in the late 90s. They would supply the Saudis with sophisticated warplanes, and in return, the Saudis would give the British 1 tanker full of oil every day for perpetuity, which the City of London would use as to ante in a chip, you might say, in the oil trading business. And in that way, they control the petrodollar. That's funny. The petrodollar is controlled by the British, if you can get your mind around that. But anyway, the son of the king, Prince Bandar, he was bribed $1 billion for this deal to go through, and it turned out that Prince Bandar was financing the terrorists while they were in the United States in flight school, learning how to take off in these, or fly jets. They didn't have to take off, or land for that matter, just aim them like a missile. But anyway, he was writing checks to his sister in San Diego, who was taking care of a couple of the Saudi terrorists. The checks, as I recall, were written on Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., which was a notorious money laundering outfit, and it was eventually shut down. But yeah, so Saudi Arabia and the British have worked in concert to develop terrorism. Bin Laden, of course, his face was put out there on the day of 9/11. This is the mastermind of this great evil. And it was like a month later that the United States invaded Afghanistan. Even though not one of the hijackers was an Afghani. Bin Laden himself was a Saudi, but supposedly he was hiding out in a cave in Afghanistan. And they couldn't find him. With all their surveillance equipment and monitoring cell phone activity, he eluded them for years, and turned up he was in Pakistan. But anyway, you can find a video on YouTube with, this was back in the 70s, when the USSR actually had invaded Afghanistan, and the United States was intent on punishing them for that. So they trained these mujahideen warriors, one of whom was a young Osama bin Laden. And there is a Zbigniew Brzezinski. He just died a year or so ago, but at the time he was the national security advisor for the Carter administration. And you can find it on YouTube there. He's telling these mujahideen warriors that they're sending off to fight the Soviets that God is on your side. So we know British and American intelligence, they developed these Islamic warriors for their use. And then after the Soviet Union dissolved, they kept them in their employ, and they became part of the scheme of the Anglos for world domination. It's interesting that there was a fellow, I forget which cabinet he was part of, but he was part of the W. Bush administration, which just came into the office in January of 2001. And their very first cabinet meeting before 9/11, he said he was astonished. They were talking about invading Iraq. And he couldn't get his mind around it. What happened in Iraq? Why? Well, 9/11 was obviously the pretext. It's funny because there was an outpouring of support for the United States after that dastardly attack, for most of which was Russia and Putin. But the United States wasn't interested in getting after terrorism. They were developing and supporting it and using it, as became apparent years later. But the United States has essentially been at war ever since it invaded Afghanistan. It's still in Afghanistan, which, by the way, here's a little factoid for you. Before the Anglo-American invasion in 2001, the Taliban had outlawed poppy production. After the Anglo-American invasion, poppy production has soared, particularly in the British-held Helmand province. So that's a key part of the British Empire, and the banking system that they control is drug running. They developed the opium business back in the 1800s. You may have heard of the Opium Wars. Well, so that was part of their scheme going into Afghanistan, was to ramp up opium production. And now there's an opioid epidemic in the United States with about 1,000 people dying every day. And a lot of opium is flooding into Russia. It's part of the attack upon Russia from the Anglo-American duo. But then in 2003, then the United States went ahead with their invasion of Iraq. And it was a trumped-up thing. You remember Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We're absolutely sure of it. No weapons were found, and the country was destroyed. Probably over 1 million Iraqis have died. Mainstream media doesn't even touch that. I've talked with people that used to live in Iraq. And yeah, Saddam Hussein was a strongman, dictator, blah, blah, blah. But he held the country together. And Christians were allowed, Catholics, whatever, were allowed to practice their worship. They lived next door to Muslims. There was no animosity. They had free health care, free schooling. Life was good before the invasion. And now the country is destroyed. The Americans are still there. And it's a training ground now for the Al-Qaeda and all these other ISIS groups. Well, there was a whole checklist of countries on the empire's hit list. Afghanistan, then Iraq. Next up on the list was Libya. And the destruction of that country took place when Obama was president. Muammar Gaddafi, then he was targeted as this ruthless guy. Well, do a little reading on that, because he used Libya's vast oil wealth to benefit the Libyans and Northern Africa. He was the greatest benefactor of Northern Africa of anyone ever. And no doubt that's why they wanted to take him out. Plus, he was keen on moving away from the petrodollar. But the United States military, or Air Force, actually had bombed Muammar Gaddafi's motorcade. And then they sent in these terrorist guys. They abused him in a horrible way. They phoned in to the Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, and said, "We have Muammar, what do we do with him?" And she went, "These people play for keeps. This is the empire we're talking about. Not necessarily America. It's the deep state that has taken over the controls of the United States military." Well, then next on the list was Syria. It seems that Qatar was running to run a pipeline through Syria, and that would be in competition with the Saudis. So the Anglos decided to, we'll just take over the whole country and do with it what we want. And they've pretty much destroyed most of Syria until Putin stepped in a couple of years ago. And of course, he's been on the Anglo hit list ever since. But it turns out he has a formidable military, and they're not so keen to rush into World War III, knowing that they'd probably be killed. The first cities that would be targeted by the Russians or Chinese obviously would be Washington, New York, London. But the elites, you know, they're building their bomb shelters and all of that, preparing for some kind of Holocaust. Well, it's been 17 years from 9/11, but now the world is on the edge here again. World War III seems to be imminent. The Anglo-American duo, they are not going to walk away from Syria. Now they're the last holdout of Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Idlib. Syria and Russia are determined to wipe them out. But the United States, through this, I don't even know where Donald Trump is. He's trying to bring about peace, but he's kind of hemmed in. If he's too friendly with Putin, he's a traitor. If he's, you know, he's under tremendous pressure. And of course, there's a demonic element. Where is it going? Well, I think the Anglo Empire has it in their mind that they're going to have a world government. And of course, that has been Satan's intention all along, to destroy the nation-state system, republicanism, whatever you want to call it, democracy, and subjugate the world to his tyranny. And he wants to do that so he can get after God's people, Jehovah's people. And it's time to occur with the coming of Christ. There's a prophecy, many prophecies, but I'll focus on one right now, in the 8th chapter of Daniel, and it has to do with what is to occur during the time of the end, in the final part of their kingdom, their, plural, Anglo-American kingdom, as the transgressors act to a completion. A fierce-looking king who understands ambiguous sayings will stand up. His power will become great, but not through his own power. He will bring ruin in an extraordinary way, and he will be successful and act effectively. He will bring mighty ones to ruin, also the people made up of the holy ones. And by his cunning, he will use deception to succeed, and in his heart he will exalt himself. And during a time of security, he will bring many to ruin. He will even stand up against the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human hand. Well, who is this fierce-looking king? Well, he hasn't come on the scene yet. How will he become mighty, but not by his own power? It's interesting, after 9/11, you know, there was a great stress building up in the financial system before 9/11. The dot-com bubble had blown, and something was going to give. And after the attack on 9/11, of course, that following week, when there were no planes flying, they shut Wall Street down to prevent an outright crash. And then over just a couple of weeks, they lowered the interest rates way, way down, and they avoided a crash. And the interest rates have been almost zero for the last few years. And you know, trillions and trillions of dollars have been pumped in to keep it from collapsing. In 2008, it almost went down with Lehman Brothers and AIG. And it's all booming now, right? It's all good. Well, no, not really. this bubble has grown to massive proportions. And I think the next 9/11 will probably be bigger, and they won't try to save the financial system. You know, some of the biggest buyers of stocks in the last 10 years have been banks. Like the Bank of Switzerland, they own like $90 billion of U.S. stock. And all the Wall Street biggies, I'm sure that's why the stock market just keeps levitating, iron. Happy times are here again. But I suspect at some point they'll collude, they'll start shorting stocks massively, and then the big catastrophe will come, and they'll maybe raise interest rates way up and just implode the whole thing. Just like those towers came down, the whole financial system will collapse and bring many to ruin. The billionaires and the millionaires who have all their money in stock, wipe them out. Set up a new financial system, which has been their intention for the last decade or so. Come in with the gold and buy up everything and demand payment upon the unpayable debt, and they'll impose a global communistic system. They'll own everything, a handful of, what did it say? By his cunning and by his deception, he will succeed. So we know the banking system, the bankers have great power, but they can't really rule the world. They need some sort of administrative capacity. And I think that's where the UN comes in. It was, of course, originally intended to be a world government. It hasn't developed into such. It's, they call it a toothless tiger. But I view it more like a placeholder. And, they could have brought the government of the United States down 17 years ago. The plane that landed in the Pentagon, if the other plane would have hit the White House, who knows what would have happened. Had they not saved the market from going down, the dollar could have crashed, whatever. But here we are again. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with Trump's situation. They might impeach him. They're trying to get the cabinet to take him out because he's mentally incompetent, but he seems pretty sharp to me. They may do the Kennedy treatment on him. That's a very real possibility. I don't know. He might not be the president when this thing comes down, but it seems like we're on a very short fuse to something catastrophic. And the real thing driving this is China, and they're developing so rapidly. They just last week announced they're investing $60 billion in developing Africa. And you read in the Western press, they're considering this an act of war and aggression, that China's colonizing Africa. Well, the British Empire has colonized Africa for 200 years. They've never relinquished their control, and their intent has always been to keep them in a backward state, prevent them from developing, so they can exploit them and their resources, their diamonds and their oil and what have you. And here comes China with this win-win situation. That's a bad thing for these financial parasites. So they can't go on too much longer with that, or China will just take over. So I suspect that they'll start a war probably and crash the whole system and take down the United States government and bring the UN as the savior of the world, and bring the IMF, the World Bank, whatever, under the authority of the United Nations. And the bankers will shift, like the Federal Reserve of the United States will shut the United States down and empower the UN. The bankers will shift their focus to the UN, and in that way, he will become powerful, but not by his own power. And then, according to other prophecy, I can't talk this morning. According to other prophecies, for instance, in Habakkuk and in Daniel as well, the king of the north will go forth in a great rage to devote many to destruction. And Habakkuk talks about this Chaldean plundering the nations and eating them like fish in a net for his own pleasure. So we're talking about a genocidal Holocaust. And that's always been the intention of the British, to cull the herd, you might say, have reduced the world's population by, they're talking about 80%. So, but Jehovah's going to allow that. What does it say in Isaiah? That I will make mortal man rarer than refined gold. So he uses this satanic agency as his punishing instrument, as it says in Habakkuk. So, thinking back to that 9/11, 2001, that was a turning point. And it set things in motion that are still going, and it seemed to be culminating now in what will surely turn out to be the beginning of the time of the end, the coming of Christ, which will bring down this system. From the ashes will come this eighth king who will terrorize the world, bring the holy ones to ruin, and be brought to his end by the Prince of Princes, Jesus Christ. So, depressing things have happened, but exciting times are ahead. For those with faith, we have the hope of surviving and being on the winning side. That's something to look forward to. Thanks for watching. It's gone cold.